Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the path between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey everyone, welcome to our next book club conversation on Augustine's Confessions, Book 3 and 4. I don't have a lot of front matter to provide you with for this episode, but there's one thing I want to mention, is that I'm running a special right now where to reward all of my Tier 3 patrons, whether you pay annually, whether you pay monthly, I'm running a special bonus gift to you at this point. And so that if you are a Tier 3 patron by the end of this week, and so that would be by the 24th of May, 2025, if you are a Tier 3 patron by that point, then I'm going to provide you with a link for access to the Life, Death, and Meaning with Beowulf and Boethius course, which I ran last, I think, fall, winter, around that time. It's an 8-week course. It has something like 24, 25 videos attached to it that walk through the whole story of Beowulf as well as Boethius's Constellation of Philosophy. And so if you, again, you're a Tier 3 member, check Patreon, find that link, and follow that link. That'll give you access to the Google Classroom for that course. Now, once you take that link, you will have indefinite access to the course. However, that link will only be valid for this week, and then the invite link is going to change. And so if you are not already a Tier 3 patron, then go ahead and upgrade or sign up this week to get that access. But for now, let's go ahead and jump right into our conversation on Augustine's Confessions, Book 3 and 4. Well, let's jump right into it here, talking about Books 3 and 4. This is, I think, where we really start to really get into it as we get into Augustine himself. You know, the first couple of books are, in many ways, just setting up what we're doing in orienting himself toward God. I mean, he goes a little bit into, some of his past, looking at the pear incident, but even that's mostly to set up sort of theologically like what his sin is, what temptation is, what sin is. And that's just kind of example. But now we're going a lot more methodically through his life, kind of step by step with the progressions that he takes. And so right at the beginning of book 3 here, we get this pretty just powerful diagnosis of his condition when he says, "I came to Carthage where a cauldron of illicit loves leapt and boiled about me. I was not yet in love, but I was in love with love, and from the very depth of my need hated myself for not more keenly feeling the need. I sought some object to love, since I was thus in love with loving, and I hated security and a life with no snares for my feet. For within I was hungry, all for the want of that spiritual food which is thyself, my God." And so, he starts off by saying, like, I loved the idea of love, but I didn't yet recognize what love was for, who love was for. And so he loved love while simultaneously hating himself. It kind of reminds me of what Tolkien says about Gollum, about how he loved and hated the ring as he loved and hated himself. It's like, because he didn't recognize the proper object of love. And then so from there on, we get his traveling and his restless heart loving various things that he ought not love, like with the Manichaeans and whatnot. So I love the way he sets this up, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. And I'm going to use the word love apparently as many times as I can. All right, Kyle, you're unmuted. Tell us something about book 3.
Yeah, I actually don't know if it was book 3. I might have been thinking about book 4,
That's fine.
going further along that same theme, but it's really interesting. Like, he sees his life so clearly in hindsight, because even in book 3 or book 4, I think it's like, if you love material things, love them in that they are in God, rather than love them for themselves. And so it's like it's not like there's a true dignity in the things in themselves. They're good in and of themselves. But if you stop there, it's still vain. It's still empty. It's like Ecclesiastes, the Solomon or the teacher, and it's just like this. There's no value here unless you follow these things towards their telos. And I, oh gosh, I don't remember who it was. I was listening to a conversation maybe 2 months ago, and it was about how Eros is meant to be a ladder towards one of the other forms of love, and that Eros is sort of like that earthly affection we have, but it's always just meant to be that compass that points us towards that love for God. And he seems to like here in the beginning of book three, he's showing like he's not looking at the like he's not looking where they're pointing, he's just looking at the things themselves, and he sees how clearly in hindsight how why that's what left him empty.
Yeah, and the way that you phrase that about how Eros is meant to lead to the higher divine love, I mean, honestly, that could equally be said by C.S. Lewis or Plato himself, in the Symposium. The idea was that the lesser loves, things like Eros, are meant to lead us to the higher love of the good. And that when we love the good, well, now we have the proper perspective for loving good things. Whereas when you love good things separate from the good, we lose the good that makes good things good. And in so doing, the things themselves may still be good, but our desires are evil because they're turned away from the good. Right? That's a very Platonic way of seeing things. And especially an Augustine way of seeing things, who, Augustine's going to redeem the material world and see that a little bit better than Plato himself does, because he recognizes like anything that exists by the will of God. Therefore, existence itself is good. I'm still wrapping up some of the Tolkien material, so I've got Tolkien still running through my mind here. But Tolkien says that he doesn't believe in absolute evil because
Yeah.
absolute evil would be non-being.
Yeah, I remember Freeman touches on that in Tolkien Dogmatics. Like there's no such thing as just the total deprivation of good. Like all
Right.
things being God's creation, just there's some virtue that's given to all things, even if it's just in the goodness, what was it? Oh, I was reading Paradise Lost yesterday for the course on Wednesday, and it's interesting because Satan is saying in book one, he's like, God has given us our mental capacity so that we would feel our pains more fully, right? Because it is a good thing that justice would be done. And so even though like Satan is an object of wrath, there is a total goodness in his preserved acuity, his preserved perception, and all of that, so that he can receive wrath more fully. So there's no such thing as that complete absence.
Right. I mean, which is why, in the Inferno, that hell is frozen over because it's as close to non-being as you can get, but it's still there. Like there was
Yeah.
still a thing that we're talking about. Um, and so yeah, and so being itself is good, and that actually is I think I believe that is a Christian philosophical position that like I don't know theologically how you get out of that, recognizing that all things are from God and all things are held together by God. Existence itself is fundamentally good, which really, if we believe that, then we have reason for joy at simply being itself, regardless of particular circumstances. This is why this idea is going to get a lot of play in Boethius a little bit later on in time. That Boethius can say that like, no matter how much injustice I'm facing right now, the fact that I'm here able to recognize injustice means that I exist and existence is good. The affirmation of existence provides a straight line to the beatific vision, followed, fully to its course or to its source. Kind of same thing, beginning and end. And so this idea that being is fundamentally good, it gets a lot of play in medieval Christian philosophy, and I think that's one reason why as much as we talk about the dark ages, I think philosophically these are the bright ages. They make so much give so much priority to just the luminosity of existence, and I think that's something that can deeply enrich and really re-enchant our lives. I often quote this Thomas Aquinas line when he says that all the efforts of the human mind cannot exhaust the essence of a single fly. Like existence is far more wondrous than we tend to think. It's marvelous. Um, all right. Rach, why don't you share something with us about and anything from this section of reading, whatever floats your boat.
I was meant to reread it last night, but um, I took my book to Bible college and thought, oh, I'll just finish off. I was reading like Luther's one of his books, and it just kept going on and on and on. So I didn't. I got my reading done for uni, but I didn't get to
Hey,
Confessions.
fair enough. I mean, Augustine Confessions, Augustinian monk. I mean, it works.
They're all, rated, right? um, but just flicking through, I find it quite interesting his fascination with the theatre and the performances and that sort of really. Sorry, I've got lots of kids around at the moment. Um, yeah, just being really like emotionally invested in these theatrical performances. Just a minute, Luke, can you take your Pokemon somewhere else? Do you do courses on Pokemons? My
Not yet.
kids
Give
might
it
be interested
time. Give
then.
it time.
um, yeah, and I just thought, like, in a similar way, how much we watch TV shows or films or things for entertainment, and we love them but hate them for the emotions that they bring out of us. Um, yeah, I think I don't know. I guess it's similar in that even if it's like 1500 years ago, more similar entertainment can bring out a similar response in humankind. We're not all that different.
No, that's absolutely true. That human nature has not fundamentally changed, and even the ways that we engage in entertainment has not fundamentally changed.
Mm,
I mean, it's changed in form, but not so much in like substance. And
mm,
I do think he makes some important points there regarding the theater, regarding literature, um, that he was taught to pity the characters in the play, to mourn for these characters, these fictional characters, but that's kind of where it ended, right? The idea of
mm,
catharsis is that you're supposed to sort of let something out in a way that allows you to actually better integrate your own psyche together. But what he was doing, and what we often tend to do, is, I mean, we might sympathize with some situation in a show we're watching, but we don't take that step further and actually recognize what this means for us. We don't mourn for ourselves in the appropriate way. We don't sorrow for ourselves in the appropriate way.
mm.
And so I do think he makes some pretty important points regarding the way that we engage with entertainment. Um, so
Yeah,
cool. Um,
that's all for now. I'll keep skim reading. Someone else can have a turn.
perfect, perfect. All right, Chase, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I liked that his kind of views on the plays and breaking down why he enjoyed it and kind of why he thought people enjoyed it. Uh, how he just talks about um, how is it that a man wants to be made sad by the sight of tragic sufferings that he could not bear in his own person. Um, I think he definitely picks on something good where sometimes um, we almost want to see sometimes like a train wreck or something go bad in somebody else's life that we can pity them, but then also kind of realize like, which is something this is a bad feeling to have, but you're like, like, oh, other people go through suffering too, right? And it's weird that we feel that way sometimes. Um, and he later on says, may it be that whereas no one wants to be miserable, there is real pleasure in pitying others. Um, and we love their sorrows because without them, we should have nothing. We should have nothing to pity. Um, yeah, and then he follows it up with some imagery of kind of not wanting them to bite too deep, um, the sorrows, but just to scratch his heart, and it basically causes inflammation and sores and pus flowing. Um, and just kind of pondering if that's even a life to have, that the life that he was living, was it even a life? It's cool.
Yeah, it's a great commentary on the superficial. He talks about how he used to pity characters in a stage play who lost something that made them happy. But then he learned that no, what I need to pity is not just when people lose things that make them happy. So oftentimes, what I need to do is pity people because they're happy. He says, but today I have more pity for the sinner getting enjoyment from his sin than when he suffers the torment from the loss of pleasure, which is ultimately destructive, and the loss of happiness, which is only misery. This is clearly the truer compassion, but the sorrow I feel him gives me no pleasure. And so, he used to feel sorry for people when, they lose the things that make them happy. Now he sorrows for people who, in their happiness, don't recognize their misery, don't recognize their sin, because that's exactly where he was, right? He didn't recognize what his misery truly was. And so now he has a new kind of perspective. Um, it makes me think of, and it's getting a little bit ahead to the next course that I'll be teaching, but to Plato's allegory of the cave. That when the guy gets out, that now he has not pride in like judgment of those who are still stuck in the cave, but now he has pity for them. He has compassion for them, and he's able to willingly now descend back into the darkness out of pity for those who are where he once was. And so, we see this idea in Plato, but I think even more profoundly in Augustine of pity for those who don't recognize their pitiable state. Um, Augustine's an interesting kind of figure that on one hand, he's obviously interested in dogma. He's obviously interested in philosophy. He's going to advocate for, for taking out certain sects of heretics. And so on one hand, he is a very theologically driven guy, but also as you read him, like he reads as somebody of a contrite and broken spirit remade by God. And so you have both strength as well as real meekness, which obviously those aren't opposites, rightly understood. Um, yeah, and Kyle mentioned in the chat here this line that I had underlined as well. The very limit of human blindness is to glory in being blind. We celebrate the very things that are handicapping us and keeping us from fulfilling our purpose, which um, again, just Augustine's idea that evil is principally in the will. We decide to be blind, essentially. We glory in it. We don't want to be healed.
I think he does a good job in sort of creating that delineation of what is well-ordered pity and what isn't. Because like you should never, he says, only in the impossible event of goodwill being malevolent could a man who is truly and sincerely filled with pity desire that there should be miserable people for him to pity. And so I don't know, it's like I don't know how to articulate it, but it's just the point of like goodness descends to it, but yeah, I don't know. It kind of seems like an obvious statement. Maybe I'm just wowed by his words. Um, but just in terms of like how twisted it is to like it's a twisted thing to almost to desire that people are in the situation such that you could serve them. Like the well ordered desire is that they're off and they're in right relationship with God and that they're not miserable, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and it kind of continues the same theme of being in love with love, but not knowing the proper object, of appreciating pity, but not knowing that the object of pity is wellness of somebody else. I've brought in Tolkien here now to bring in Lewis. Reminds me of Till We Have Faces when Orwell says of Psyche, I wish I were. Or I wish she was my slave so I could set her free. It's like there's this twisted kind of idea where I want to feel like I had the moral superiority by expressing pity, but I don't actually want them to be well. And
It's
so, yeah.
not, yeah. It's also interesting this sort of slavery theme that runs through, right? Because at the end of what is this, section one of book one, when it's got the Roman numeral, I don't know what it's technically called, but the last sentence, I wore my chains with bliss, but with torment too, for I was scourged with the red hot rods of jealousy, with suspicions and fears and tempers and quarrels. And I don't want to read that out of context. But then later on, he goes on and he says, I wandered from you in my arrogance, going ever further away from you, loving my way and not your ways, in love with my runaway liberty, which my footnote says is an allusion to being a runaway slave. And so it's interesting because it's like these passions for for a disordered pity, these passions for disordered friendship. Um, he likens them to like these slave masters of him, it seems, almost. And but it's also interesting because he's glorying in that slavery, because he says he wears his chains with bliss, and that he is in love with his runaway liberty. And it's like, I know, my favorite quote from the Oxford Classics comes in book 9, and it's, "How sweet it became to me to be without the sweets of folly. What I once feared to lose became a delight to dismiss." That's in book 9. That's the Oxford Classics translation. And it's, you see the progression of he's loving his chains, to he's loving to be without his chains, as his affections are becoming better ordered throughout the Confessions.
So I thought this portion was that he was like the first one is basically that he's like chained to his lusts. But then later on, when it talks about like the runaway slave, it seemed like he's moving further away from you, loving my way and not your ways, in love with my runaway liberty. Just meaning like
Yeah,
I I
I'm
kind
not
of I kind
claiming
of
that, sorry, I'm not claiming that he's referencing the same thing. I'm just making the observation of there seems to be that narrative theme that
okay,
he's
yeah,
using to paint the image.
yeah, because I think this one's like more of like a disobedient slave running away, enjoying the little bit of liberty that you have, rather than like staying with the faithful master, whatever. But yeah,
Yeah, and the way that you frame that, Kyle, it reminds me of a quote from City of God, where Augustine says, "The good man, though a slave, is free. The wicked, though he reigns, is a slave, and not the slave of a single man, what is far worse, the slave of as many masters as he has vices." And so, and again, maintaining that this slave kind of language that the good man may in fact be an actual slave, but he's free because he's living in accord with the purpose of human nature. He has his loves rightly oriented, whereas the bad man, he may be reigning, but he's a servant to his lust. He's not in control of his own passions, and that's not freedom. And that I think speaks pretty directly to our modern understandings of freedom. I encounter this all the time teaching philosophy at a public university. I'll ask students, what does freedom mean? And with various wording, they basically say freedom is being able to do whatever you want to. But then, I follow up with, okay, why do you want what you want? And if you want the wrong things that are constantly leading you to a less free kind of life, you're becoming addicted to your own vices. Is that actual freedom? I mean, I take a little bit longer to lead them to in that direction, but eventually, it starts to become obvious that simply doing whatever you want is not freedom, because very often we want the wrong things. Plato says one of the worst things that can happen to you is you want the wrong things and you get them.
Mike
And I think
Tyson
that's,
says that too,
well, Plato probably got it from Mike Tyson.
probably. Great minds think alike.
Yes, obviously, that great philosopher, Mike Tyson. Reminds me of video. I don't remember, it was like a couple years ago or so, when it's like a kid, it's like a 6-year-old kid or something, was interviewing Mike Tyson and asked him like, "What's the meaning of life?" or something, and he he just said to this kid, "They said there is none. Just go do stuff."
I
Like,
just want to know who
it's
lets
such
their
a doubter.
6-year-old near Mike Tyson.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's kind of on them, I guess.
uh,
All right, back to
with what
Augustine.
you're with what you were saying, I had read a preface to Paradise Lost yesterday, and it was the Milton and St. Augustine chapter, and it was just saying, for as he shows his benevolence in creating good natures, he shows his justice in exploiting evil wills. Kind of going along with like what you were saying of he's going to use, he's going to allow you to like go with what you're doing, kind of to exploit you, to break you down and bring you back up.
Yeah, and then it's continuing in his narrative here. So he goes from highlighting his superficial engagement with entertainment, with the theater, with plays, And then he brings up when he first had his philosophical awakening, and it's when, as a rhetorician, he was studying Cicero, who is principally studied for his rhetoric. That's what he was known for. But Augustine goes a little bit deeper. While his colleagues are reading Cicero so they know how to speak better, Augustine's actually reading Cicero to see what he's saying. And out of that, he is awakened to a desire to study philosophy. He's awakened to the early stages of a love for wisdom, which is going to lead him in the wrong places along the path. But ultimately, this is the beginning point of his like intellectual movement toward God, even though he doesn't know that's where he's headed yet. And it reminds me of in I can't remember if it's Screwtape Letters or Screwtape Proposes a Toast, but in one of them, Screwtape is talking about how um, the, how they've the forces of hell have basically convinced moderns to study the ancient text, the great texts, for kind of form, for style, to learn about like historical realities regarding the text, or how people are talking, how people are thinking. But what they don't want people to do is actually read the text for what they are saying, as if they're actually saying things that may be true, that may actually come into terms with the way that we understand wisdom, the way that we understand the world today. And Augustine does exactly that. That um, yeah. All right. Well, thanks for stopping by, Rach. Hope to see you next time.
Yeah,
But
see
yeah,
you in a fortnight. All going well.
yes, yes, absolutely. All right.
Bye.
So Augustine, he actually reads Cicero for Cicero, and he actually discovers something of wisdom, and now he's going forth to actually, pursue that wisdom. And so we get that again, substance over mere aesthetics, I suppose, which is probably rare for rhetoricians.
There's a part, Augustine's hard to read in some ways. Because in that same section, he says, that book excited and inflamed me. In my ardor, the only thing I found lacking was that the name of Christ was not there. For with my mother's milk, my infant heart had drunk in and still held deep down in it that name, according to your mercy, O Lord, the name of your Son, my Savior. And whatever lacks that name, no matter how learned and excellently written and true, could not win me wholly. And I find that so strange, being where this is in his life, that I almost just don't know how to interpret it, as if this is something that he's like saying in hindsight retroactively, or if it's like this subconscious thing, because he's, to my understanding, and I mean my reading comprehension is far from the best, he's still living in rebellion. Yet for whatever reason, like he says that it lacks the name of Christ. um I don't know. I got to that, and it just put questions in my mind and no answers. So I was wondering what you guys thought.
I think what I got was, I mean, he's writing all of this as reflections from later on, right? This is stuff that he's grappled with this um, over the years, and so looking back on this time when he saw, like, okay, maybe this is why I didn't like what did I find lacking in Cicero? Why did I seek out scriptures even though they were less majestic? Like, what would be the reasoning? Is how I'm interpreting it, and him basically saying, like, where he says, "For with my mother's milk, my infant heart had drunk in, and still held deep down in it the name according to your mercy." So even from like his mother, he was had gotten some, but it hadn't taken root, like he should know what it is, but he's so blinded by his lust and probably his schooling also, and just surroundings, that he didn't recognize it at the time.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that even though he's in a state of rebellion morally as well as intellectually, that he did get something from his mother, and that he did have a desire for something of what she provided him with. And so even when he falls in with the Manichaeans, that's kind of a Christian Zoroastrian heresy, but there is some Christianity to be found there. The Manichaeans would certainly claim that. And so it's like even though he's engaging in all these I don't know, these cults and these heresies and these vain philosophies, like there's still something of his mother's faith there, at the very least in name. And so it's like he desires the name of Christ, but he doesn't desire Christ. And I think
Yeah.
that, yeah, and I think that honestly, a lot of people today can probably relate to that. And, the whole like evangelical movement, or, people so deconstruct the faith, but they still want to maintain certain labels. They still want to maintain, certain wordings that they want to maintain the appearance of what they came up with, even if they projected the substance.
Yeah. And I imagine part of it, I think he's so insightful. I think there's a part of him that knows where the fullness is, but there are things he doesn't want to give up. And I'm remembering, sorry, it's been less than 6 months since I last read this, so some of this is still fresh in my mind. I'm gonna jump ahead. But I don't even remember where it is. But like during his final conversion, he's talking about how he had read a story of an Egyptian saint that had converted immediately. This would be so much more insightful if I remembered quotes or what the book was. And I remember he was saying, it's like, oh, how that convicted me, how quickly he turned from his sin when I have still been trying to hold on to mine. And it was kind of just like this watershed moment where he finally realized that he needed to give it all up. So I wonder how much of it is that, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting how he seems to have his toes in the water, but he just doesn't want to jump. And then it's even like later on the next section, he finds another excuse to be repelled by Christ again, because now he's reading the scriptures. And he says, my conceit was repelled by their simplicity, and I had not the mind to penetrate into their depths. They were indeed of a nature to grow in your little ones, but I could not bear to be a little one. I was only swollen with pride, but to myself I seemed a very big man. And so he's constantly finding these things to excuse himself to walk away again. Um, I don't know. It's really interesting. It's a very interesting relationship.
Yeah, and what a line to say. My conceit was repelled by their simplicity, and had not the mind to penetrate into their depths. And so he was too proud to see the simplicity, but also too proud to recognize the depths of what's there. And so he just he was repelling against. I think as you mentioned there, he's repelling against kind of what he already knows to be true. He's looking for excuses not to believe. Um, And so this is one reason why he is attracted to the Manichaeans, because they maintain certain Christian ideas, at the very least, certain Christian vocabulary, but it seems a lot more complex and sophisticated than plain Christian faith. The plain Christian faith that he would have most keenly associated with the plain Christian faith of his mother, who was not a learned theologian. She was not a great philosopher. She was just a simple woman of faith. And so to him, that's probably what Christianity was, and he wanted something more sophisticated, more learned than that, which kept him from recognizing just how deep and profound the scriptures are.
Yeah, I think it that line just reminded me of like when non-Christians read and they don't understand what the parables are, and they like put it out and they're like, this doesn't make any sense, or this is what it's supposed to mean, and then everyone else is like, no, that's not what it means. You're not understanding. Uh, a lot of this section too just reminds me of kind of my journey through my faith of, you know, not growing up in the I did grow up in the church, and then kind of was trying to find like a good church my entire adult life, and kind of like just throwing myself all the way in. And not, it wasn't like it was a heretical cult or something like that. It was like a Christian church. It was just maybe their emphasis was on stuff that wasn't, you know, the depth I was looking for. Um, which kind of shows down here where it says these names were always on their lips, but only as sounds and tongue noises, for their heart was empty of the true meaning. And it just makes me think of either all the people that are like they'll use the name of Christ, or call out Christians, or there's people on social media that will just say, like, I'm gonna use Christianity to fight Christians and stuff like that. That it they aren't actually speaking truth. They don't believe the things, or they're twisting it to make it kind of their own thing. And you think you're getting digging in the depths of wisdom, but you're really just very surface level.
Yeah, and in the language that Augustine uses, I mean, he's ultimately he's looking for the fountain of truth and not just some true things. I mean, ultimately speaking, that's where he's being led, even though again he takes some missteps along the way. Um, yeah, Kyle, what were you going to say?
Well, I was gonna say, it seems like Augustine is a guy that we can't read in absolutes because he starts out talking about how pity is disordered, at least in most cases. And then like there is that exception that's made for it, right? That we already talked about. And now he's like, talking about how scripture is simple and is for children. And then he also wrote, I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation, De Trinitate or whatever it is, like this big corpus on the Trinity. And I don't know. I wonder if it's maybe, I guess I'm asking your advice if we should read him with that nuance, or should we read him more absolutely and just sort of take him for his word?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's simultaneously true that the Christian faith is simple. I mean, in that, you know, Christ says that, you know, my yoke is easy, that you don't have to be learned to understand the faith. But at the same time, any statement made in the scriptures, if we recognize it as divine wisdom, is going to have infinite depths that we can plunge. And so you could have Augustine truly saying that if the scripture is simple, you don't need a seminary degree to pick up the scripture and get the basic meaning, to read the gospels and understand the basics of what Jesus is saying. But at the same time, you could study for an eternity and not mind the depths of what's revealed there. And so I think it's simultaneously true, as he says, that it's simple and that it is complex and infinitely profound. And by the way, side note, I definitely endorse his De Trinitate or his On the Trinity. It's a beautiful expression of Trinitarian theology. My first paper publication was a chapter um, showing the Augustinian, specifically his doctrine of the Holy Spirit in Calvin's Institutes. And so I worked a good bit with that De Trinitate. It's beautiful. Highly recommend it. But that's kind of a side note, I guess.
I got to get through smaller books first.
Fair enough. But that's not a bad follow up. So maybe it goes Confessions, on the Trinity, and then City of God.
The first, this is another tangent. The first audiobook I ever attempted was City of God. So I was driving to my wedding for 4 hours listening to City of God on Audible. And I'm going to be honest, I don't think I understood any of it.
Yeah,
But
that is not an audiobook kind of book.
yeah, granted, listening is never as good for me as reading. Like I listened to Constellation Philosophy recently, and I mean, it was simple. Like it was a real quick listen, but listening just doesn't work for me. But I
Yeah, I mean,
digress.
for a book like Constellation or City of God, that can work once you're already very familiar with the paper text. Um, but you know, I would love in the future. I mean, side note, we'll get back to our study in just a second. But I mean,
We're
I'd
still on
love to
book
do
three.
more. I know. But I would love to do more with Augustine moving forward. One of my best classes I ever took was a seminar class on Augustine, in which we read pretty much all of his major works, the Confessions on Christian Doctrine, on the Trinity, City of God, some of his anti-Pelagian writings. By far, just the best single course I've ever taken. So I'd just recommend reading anything Augustine has to write.
Have you read the Dan? I'm gonna let me
You can use English,
give me 2 seconds.
sure.
Sorry, I'm still here. I just need to. It is Brown, Peter Brown, the biography. Yeah, Peter Brown.
I have not, no.
Okay. I haven't gotten to it yet. I picked it up, but I've heard it's very good. In
Okay,
case you're
cool,
looking to add something to your reading list. Peter Brown, Augustine of Hippo.
cool.
All
All
right,
right.
we can get back to it. Sorry, Chase.
All right, let's see where are we now? Um,
We're
so
in
yeah, so
section
he
7.
so he gets in with the Manichaeans. He has these various questions that he's trying to grapple with. A big thing for him was the problem of evil, dealing with this question of like, where does evil come from? What is evil? If you have an all-powerful, all-sovereign God, then how do we account for evil as something other than a creation of God? Like that's something that he's trying to deal with here, as well as the question of like what is God? What does it mean to have an immaterial being? Because Augustine, coming out of Roman culture, like the Romans didn't have a category for a transcendent, purely immaterial God, which is why the Romans accused the early Christians of being atheists, because they assumed that Christians were just denying deity altogether because they had a very different understanding of what the deity actually was. And so these are just some of the philosophical issues that he's dealing with that the Manichaeans, at least for a time, provide him with some answers for. But ultimately, he just doesn't find them to be satisfactory, which is going to move him back in the direction of Christian orthodoxy.
Are the Manichaeans a different group, or are they the same group as the astrologers?
They they're related. I mean, the Manichaeans, as a sort of melding Christianity and Zoroastrianism, yeah, they would definitely incorporate astrology. So I believe that's part of the
Okay.
same arc. Same arc.
Okay. I thought that was so funny from the one bishop. It was just like, look, if he's smart enough and if he does the reading, he'll see that it's wrong.
Right. Um, and I mean, I appreciate that patient kind of approach. And his mother is pleading like, you got to go talk to this guy. You got to go talk to Augustine. You got to set him straight. And yeah, he just says, like, just give him some time. He'll come around. It's just finally he basically out of frustration tells Monica, Augustine's mother, don't worry about it. He'll come around. Stop pestering me. Essentially, like there's no way that a mother could shed this many tears over her son and not have them get a response. And so that was enough for her. And then of course she receives this dream that confirms that idea.
Yeah, I think watching the sort of the arc of Monica and her life over the course of Confessions is really encouraging, and just how you see
Yeah.
how her prayer is rewarded.
Yeah.
It's kind of tough to read. Sorry, I'm saying something else, but again, it's kind of tough to read because it's like, so all right, so we're talking about Cicero, we're talking about how he's too proud for scripture, talking about all of these things, and then and I'm sure it's related. Then he kind of breaks off in what seems like a tangent of divine justice and how it doesn't change, but it seems to change. Or it doesn't even seem to change, but it relates to people differently depending on their time period. Um, and then we're at the Manichees, and it's like how I read that and it's like I'm not sure how I'm supposed to place this in this narrative because it's
Yeah, I
like
think
we have like your life, and then we have a theological tangent, and we're back to your life, and then we're back to a theological tangent, and he's just writing whatever goes into his mind, and yeah, I don't know. I digress.
Yeah, I think here he's like basically using all of that with like a theological tangent right here of the patriarchs and how they're actually um, they were righteous even though they were still human to counteract with that line of one of the questions the Manichaeans asked was, and are those patriarchs to be esteemed righteous who had many wives at the same time and slew men and offered sacrifices for many animals? Um, so kind of just like rebuking his own ignorant
Okay,
self
I see.
and
I
them
right.
think I
So
too.
missed
Yeah.
that.
yeah, he's bringing up these questions that he had that he couldn't answer at the time, but now he can, and so he's answering his former self here, which I mean he raises some of the same kind of issues that secularists will raise today against Christianity. Like, oh, did God change his mind between the Old and the New Testament? And Augustine's giving us I think, a pretty solid answer to that. That even today, what may be lawful in the morning or at a certain time of the day might not be lawful another time. I mean, in my own household, like the children are allowed to be awake at certain times and they're allowed or they need to be asleep other times. And so too with the course of history that there's no reason why the standard transcendent justice of God can't demand certain things at some time and other things at other times. Um, yeah, but to I mean really respond to your question, yeah, it just he seems to be answering his younger self. And then, yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, the astrology bit that he's drawn into these astrologers, and you know, it's kind of an interesting topic when you start talking about astrology and what's going to happen with medievalism. Especially coming out of studying Lewis, the discarded image, that sort of stuff. When you get into like medieval cosmology versus astrology, and really, the dividing line here seems to be that pagan astrology is fatalistic, where they say, basically, I'm not responsible, that the heavens are responsible for the way that I'm living my life. And so it robs you of your own agency and your own responsibility. Whereas what seems to be the prevailing consensus with the medieval theologians regarding the heavens is that the heavens do have influences over this life. I mean, even that word, like, or even like influenza, has a relation to the influences of the heavens. And so the heavens have influences, but they aren't ultimately a deciding factor in the way that we live our lives. They're simply that influences that then we choose to relate ourselves to positively or negatively. And so the difference here between pagan astrology and Christian medieval cosmology really comes down to where is agency located.
Yeah, it's humbling, I think, for me. Um, it's humbling to me to see Augustine fall into these things because, like, I guess I don't know. I mean, I'm raised in a different time period, obviously, right? But like, it seems obvious. I'm like, all right, you say something so vague, you're gonna eventually it's gonna, some ways it's gonna ring true, right? Like it's that game of chance that he was speaking with that one man about. And you have this great saint of the faith falling into these cults that otherwise I might make like a rash judgment on a person on if I knew them that were going to fall into it. So it's humbling for me to read it. Um,
Yeah, and I suppose that this is, I mean, it's a major temptation of, those of us who might have more of a romantic kind of impulse. I mean, Augustine definitely has a romantic impulse where he is very much led by his heart, but at the same time, we all are, whether we recognize it or not. We're led by our desires. As Pascal says, the heart has its reasons of which the mind knows not. And I think that's fundamentally true. We just see that in particular display in someone so intellectual, but also so passionate as Augustine. I mean, even in his attachment to the astrologers, it's not even so much that at this time he thinks that they have the better argument. It's that they seem to have the more powerful argument, the more compelling argument. And that's enough for him at this point. And so, as much as he's an intellectual, he's first and foremost, I mean, he's a romantic. He's someone who follows his passions, which can be good or dangerous depending on where you're directed.
yeah, I guess it's kind of like that idea that and that beauty is its own apologetic. Um, which there's definitely truth in that, right? In terms of beauty is a transcendental attribute found in God. So if something's beautiful, it gets that from God. Um, I don't know. What do you perceive as beautiful? I don't know. I'm just talking. I don't.
Again, it's very Augustinian. It's just say stuff and go wherever the thoughts take you. Um, Well, so after dealing with this, well, not really dealing with, but moving past the astrology bit, at this point we go to his relationship with his friend back home who was sick. They both grew up together with some experience of the Christian faith. This guy maintained his faith, whereas Augustine rejected it. And his friend gets sick to the point of near death, and so they baptize him while he's unconscious. And then he wakes up and has reaffirmed faith, and doesn't want any of Augustine's mockery or his scorn. And at that point, there's this dividing line between them, which obviously we're getting into the territory of baptismal regeneration. I don't know your theologies of baptism here, but it's clear that Augustine's and he's not unusual in this, and certainly believing that baptism actually does something, like it's sacramentally. It's not simply a ceremony. He seems to believe that baptism actually basically confirmed faith in his friend, even though he wasn't conscious for it. I don't know. What do you guys think of that?
Well, that's something that I wrestle with. So I come from an evangelical background, and I've slowly been drifting away from just that. But yeah, it's interesting because you read this, and I don't know where I am in the regeneration, but it's true. I mean, something I'm not going to call him a liar, right? And so if he's saying that this happened, then okay, this happened. And then also you have the same thing even later on, which is like the relic experience, where there's that healing episode from the bones of the saint, and it's like this isn't even like this is Romanist almost. And it's like again, I'm not going to call him a liar, but I guess how do I grapple with these things? That's a good point. I also just think it's funny because like it's not credo baptism because as far as I know, the guy's unconscious. But it's not pedo baptism. Like he's a full-grown adult, so I don't know. I'm wondering what Baptistic school of thought does this episode belong to? It's a whole new thing.
Yeah, I mean, as we mentioned last time, I mean, it was typical practice at this time to delay baptism with this idea that baptism, literally washes away your sin and confirms faith. They would push it back basically until you're about to die, because that way you would, wash it clean before you die, before you stain yourself up again. This is why Constantine wasn't baptized until his deathbed experience. Um, and you know, I I feel comfortable saying that's not the right approach. I do have a lot of questions. I don't know where I stand really on a number of issues. I've come to the point of I think my favorite label for myself is Reformed lowercase c Catholic, whatever that means. I don't know. I don't really know either. I'm comfortable saying don't wait until you're dying to get baptized, but beyond that, I don't know. I'm still working through some of this myself as well.
Yeah, well, it's a problem I've especially worked through with my daughter that was born because like we go
Yeah.
our church is fully I'm definitely and we can move on after my personal, but I've become in the Pado Baptist camp 100%. Like I think that is seen as historically normative, and if scripture's ambiguous, that's how I'll read it. Um, at the same time, though, baptism is not. Baptism's more than church membership. It's not less than church membership. And so, do I feel? Have I felt a sort of call from God to leave church? I haven't. I think church membership is significant enough that there should be clarity, right? I don't want to treat it vainly as though like that shopping. So I don't know. It's something I've thought about a lot. And this, I remember reading this the first time I was thinking about it a lot. So it's interesting. It's very outside what is within my frame of experience, which is why it's reading historical text is one of those wonderful things because it's like we don't recognize the water that we're swimming in until we jump out of it and go into a different ocean.
I think if we start now, we might have just enough time to get to the end of the Paedo Baptism, Credo Baptism debate. We can have it out
I
right
don't
here and we'll
I
know.
don't think there's not enough time in all of our lives put together for that.
Yeah, as long as we don't start drowning each other like the Protestants of old over the baptismal debates.
And we may move past this. I'll just one last thing with this book three. When he talks about his mother and says she did not cease to pray at every hour, bewail me to you, and her prayers found entry into your sight. But for all that you allowed me still to toss helplessly in that darkness. Um, yeah, it's just cool seeing like how faithful she was, and reminds me of like the men and women in my life that have prayed for me or my brother, anybody, just constantly, and you're not necessarily seeing the fruit of it until years later, um, because you still need time to be polished.
Yeah, the story of Monica is so encouraging in that Augustine in I mean, I guess I don't know if I want to say he's a household name. Maybe he's not anymore, even in Christian circles. But Augustine is obviously a major figure in the history of the church. But you don't have Augustine without Monica. You don't have um, so much of either Catholicism or even, I would argue, you don't have a Protestant Reformation without Augustine. When you look at where the Protestant reformers drew their inspiration from, between Luther, between Calvin, you don't have them without Augustine, and you don't have Augustine without Monica. And it just shows how world shaping the prayers of a weeping mother can be. And I think that alone is something worth pulling out of the Confessions.
Yeah, I heard a brief like clip from uh, Richard Nixon talking about his mother, and I saw it recently this week, and it was like there's probably not going to be any books written about her, but and just compared to like books written about him, good or bad, but um, just interesting to see like how much I guess this is talked about, but then there was someone that led him, being Monica, led him there.
Yes, Augustine is just like Richard Nixon. It's clearly what we're getting out of this.
Richard
But
Nixon
yeah.
and Mike Tyson. That's where we're at.
Hmm. Well, I mean, so his friend, his friend dies finally in the faith, and Augustine celebrates this, celebrates looking back the fact that his friend was spared his consolation, which inevitably would have contributed to his abandonment of the faith, his apostasy. And so he sees this as a grace that his friend was taken home at the time that he was. But then Augustine sort of just spirals out into this despair over the death of his friend, and probably really the double death of his friend. That at the time he's despairing not only that his friend is taken away, but also that his friend recognized a good that he did not know. And so there was that relational break as well as the physical break of physical death. Um, and so that leads him into despair, but it's the right kind of despair that allows him to look beyond himself. That you have to descend before you can ascend, as he says a little bit later on. And so even this despair itself was a grace.
Yeah, I mean, praise God, because I couldn't imagine the weight of guilt had he not repented of his apostasy and then died, that Augustine would then have to reconcile with forever. But no, it's yeah. I mean, he kind of shows the full range of like an emotional experience, and he does a great job cutting through all of it, showing like where is this pointing, where is this pointing, where is this pointing, here's this pointing. Um, I'm looking for where. It's okay. You guys can talk. I'm just
Yeah, I mean, even the feeling like at the time the despair that he'd be in, but you even later on, years later, when he's grown in his faith, coming back and being like, oh my gosh, like feeling the full weight of that, um, this must have been hard.
I think this is interesting. This is what I was looking for. So he's talking about how he makes new friends. Time goes on, he makes new friends, and it's therapeutic. But he says, and it was all one huge fable, one long lie. And by its adulterous caressing, my soul, which lay itching in my ears, was utterly corrupted. For my folly did not die whenever one of my friends died. And it's like he's continuing to go deeper into the foolishness, and he's replacing the one friend that obviously couldn't satisfy his soul and perished with more friends that obviously can't satisfy his soul and will perish. And so he's tracking down that folly further down the road, despite the pain and the torment that has already just assailed him.
Yeah, we just see this ongoing working out of this restless heart idea that comes from that iconic statement at the beginning of the Confessions. that his heart is restless, that he's looking for peace while scorning the path to peace. And so he just continues to throw himself into various things. And, even when he experiences this despair, he doesn't yet recognize the value of despair, the value of despairing over his own condition. And so he just does whatever he can to hide from that reality. He's simultaneously hiding from God and hiding from himself, because to recognize either one truly is to recognize the other. You can't know, as so Calvin says, that all knowledge comes down to love of, or to knowledge of God and knowledge of yourself. And so if we in our neglect of one, we're ultimately neglecting the other as well. And we definitely see that playing out here, as he's afraid to stop and just to be. It's like a stone skipping across the water. As soon as it stops, that's when it sinks. So he has to do what he can to keep moving.
And it kind of just it reminds me of that quote earlier, in terms of like the end of our blindness is like the glory of the blindness. Like it just leads into itself, and it just gets thicker and it gets darker the more that you follow your blindness.
I did like toward the end of book four, when he reads Aristotle, and he says, he reads the 10 categories, and he says, basically, everyone else read this and they didn't understand it, but I
Yeah,
understood it right away, and it was incredibly simple to me. It's like,
he's the master of the humble brag. But it's like
yes,
I didn't even register this was supposed to be difficult.
right. And so he just understands it right away, and then he tries to put God into these categories, but it doesn't work. Which all of these experiences he has, these highs that he has in his philosophical and his religious pursuits, he understands Aristotle more than his colleagues. He sees deeper than even the greatest of the Manichaeans are able to see, and he just is going to recognize again and again that any value that these different systems have to offer ultimately falls short of what he's pursuing. And so he gets frustrated again and again and again, which is helping to build the sense of despair of, okay, maybe wisdom isn't where I'm seeking it. And so that's preparing him for his conversation with Ambrose, which I believe is coming up in the next section or the next couple books.
I thought it was also really neat, because he says, not only did all this not profit me, it actually did my harm. And then I tried to understand you, my God, marvelous in your simplicity, and you really, and that whatsoever had being was to be found within these 10 categories. So it's like he's recognizing, all right, I attempted to fit God within this box. I attempted to use this Aristotelian metaphysic and use that to understand God, but God transcends that. And so it's leading me down paths that aren't fruitful. And then it seems like right after he invented divine simplicity, where he says, your greatness of beauty, as if they might inherit about it. In fact, your greatness and your beauty are yourself. I was like, whereas, and yeah, he goes on, which I thought was interesting. Just as like a little Easter egg. Because my understanding is that he actually did invent that doctrine. So I thought it was neat to see it there in play. But yeah, and I mean, I've never read Aquinas. Um, I know nothing of Aquinas except what I've heard other people say of him. But my understanding is that he loves Aristotle, Augustine loves Plato, and I guess it would be interesting for them to like to dialogue on this passage of where is Aristotle appropriate, where is he not appropriate? Maybe in heaven with the virtuous pagans if they get there.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's kind of you bring up the point that we've talked about in other classes and stuff, how people can be, too intelligent for their own good of finding the faith, whether it's like somebody like Jordan Peterson, it's like almost there, but they're like trying to dissect everything. They're trying to like, even with the Manichaeans, he's like asking all these questions that like really aren't important questions, even though they seem like they're deep and they're that type of stuff. Um, and it just kind of like slowed, even though he eventually got there, it slowed how fast he was to find the real truth.
Yeah, it's like people getting a big fuss about dinosaurs. Where were they in the Bible? They're not in this narrative. And it's like, that's really not the point. That's really not the point of the writings at all. And you're trying to read it in a way that is not meant to be read.
Wait. Are you telling me there aren't dinosaurs in Job? That's what I hear.
Maybe not that I know of. I'm I, I'm doubtful.
Yeah,
Maybe dragons
as am
though.
I. I mean, that's more compelling to me personally. There's a good reason for that. Um, so yeah, and so he reads Aristotle. He sees some value in that. The other books of the liberal arts, he says, but he says that I enjoyed the books while not knowing him from whom came whatever was true or certain in them. For I had my back to the light and my face to the things upon which the light falls. So he was looking at true things, but he was looking away from the truth.
Is that a direct allusion to the cave allegory? Is that what he's doing there?
It's very Platonic language. Um, Probably so. He's looking
Yeah.
at the shadow rather than the substance.
Yeah. I didn't think about it reading it, but you mentioned it earlier, and now that jumps out. Like that must be what he was doing. But yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's wonderful. And it's nice because again, me coming from like my evangelical background, sometimes there's this really naive idea of like things have to be explicitly missional or like explicitly theological to be good. And it's like, no, things are good in and of themselves, right? Like light is casting on these things. Light is casting on these images, and that's true light, and that's good light, and that's beautiful light. It's just, and you can be satisfied in that light, but it's just that you won't be fully satisfied until you find the source of light itself. And I love the way it dignifies just like the surrounding things as well, that imagery.
Yeah. Augustine makes this point in his book on Christian doctrine that some people even then would criticize Christian use of pagan things, of pagan texts, pagan ideas. What has Jerusalem to do with, or what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? That kind of idea. And Augustine says, well, wait a minute. In order to even read scripture, you have to learn language. There's nothing inherently Christian about Greek language. And so like you have to learn things in order to even approach scripture that aren't themselves explicitly scriptural. And so too, why not, why can't we recognize the value that comes from pagan sources, recognizing all true value ultimately comes from God anyways. And so he compares it to the Israelites plundering the Egyptians, saying basically we're putting things back into the proper context, that we actually have a right to the truth. And so, it's this idea that all truth is God's truth wherever it can be found. Very, very Augustinian idea.
Yeah, I I did I studied math in college, and I remember having just thinking it's like if God has a native language, it probably sounds a lot more like mathematics than like Hebrew. And it's just like things are ordered everywhere, right? It's like you look at the way the trees blow in the wind, and that teaches you something about God, right? Like if nothing else, it teaches you the order and the meticulousness and sort of like the particularity with which he makes things. Um, and I'm gonna quote John Piper here, which you guys might roll your eyes at, and that's okay. I roll my eyes. But he does have this really nice imagery of like the fact that God paints the same sunset every day and every day and every day. And it's like he continuously delights to do these things for eternity because the sun is always rising somewhere. And it's like we look at that and we are filled with awe. And God again says again and again and again, and he paints the paintbrush again and again and again. And it's just like his glory is everywhere. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I'm rehashing the same thing I said, but I love it. I love to see that reflected.
I'm in trouble if we have to do any type of proofs in heaven to understand anything. So
Yeah, that approach to mathematics being the divine language is very Pythagorean.
Well, hey, all truth is God's truth.
Fair enough. Cool. Well, I mean, we've been going on for a little while. Is there anything else that from either of these books, book 3 or book 4, that you want to mention?
I think we got through everything I would have wanted to talk about.
All right. So next time we'll cover 5 and 6, but I'll end by reading just this concluding paragraph here from book 4. O Lord our God, let us hope in the protecting shadow of thy wings. Guard us and bear us up. Bear us up, thou wilt, as tiny infants, and on to our gray hairs. For when thou art our strength, it is strength indeed. But when our strength is our own, it is only weakness. With thee our good ever lives, and when we are averted from thee, we are perverted. Let us now return to thee, O Lord, that we may not be overturned. For with thee lives without any defect our good, which is thyself. We have no fear that there should be, we have no fear that there should be no place of return, merely because by our own act we fell from it. Our absence does not cause our home to fall, which is thy eternity. I think it's a good place to wrap. Next time we'll get the next couple books. Until then.
All right. Is the history of ideas this week, or is that next week?
That begins next week.
Okay.
So this week we've got Latin and Paradise Lost starting, and then next week we've got History of Ideas.
I do not have the capacity for Latin, but I will try and I'll be at Paradise Lost. I'll try and be at History of Ideas.
Cool.
Right.
I'm trying to keep up with both of those. We'll see what happens. I really want to. If nothing else, I'll backtrack at some point, but I'm going to try to keep up with those courses as well as we move forward. All right, cool. Well, I will see you guys around.
Thanks. See ya.
All right, see ya. All right, thanks for following with us for that conversation. Our next Confessions conversation will be on the 26th, Monday the 26th, at 9 p.m. Eastern. And if you want to participate, then all you need to do is sign into our Patreon, enroll in our Patreon community, whether as a paid member or a free member. This is open to everybody. And so just enroll with our Patreon at any level, and you will be able to find that link and join us for the next conversation. But otherwise, just feel free to continue following along with us. And now, before we go, I do want to thank all of my patrons for supporting me and helping me to just continue doing the various things that we're doing. We've got so much going on, and even more that's in the works, and I'll talk about a little bit more of that next time. But by name, I would like to thank all Tier 3 patrons and higher. And so that's Mark, Amanda, Chase, Chaz, Christopher, Clinton, David, Don, Aaron, Evie, Jamie, Justin, Kyle, Paul, Roger, Ross, Tyler, and William. That list is getting longer and longer, which is fantastic. And I hope that more of you will consider joining us. More of you will consider going up to that Tier 3 level, which is the way to get most access. And even still, if you purchase a Tier 3 annual patronage, then I'll give you access to all the upcoming courses that start within that term. And I'll even throw in, for a limited time, I'll throw in the Brief History of Ideas course, which just started, but that will soon drop off of that annual deal. So go ahead and take advantage of that now. But whether you become a paid patron or not, I appreciate you walking these trails with us. And until next time, Godspeed.